At various points, at least 6 different human species lived on Earth at the same time. Homo erectus spread across Asia for nearly 2 million years. Homo floresiensis, a small-statured human nicknamed the Hobbit, isolated on an island in Indonesia. Homo naledi, discovered deep in a South African cave system with a strange mixture of primitive and modern features. The Denisovans, known mostly from a handful of bone fragments in a Siberian cave. And the Neanderthals, a most famous and most misunderstood relatives who ruled Ice Age Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years. And then there was us, Homo sapiens, latecomers, evolving in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, and for most of our early existence, just one more human species among several, not the guaranteed winners of some evolutionary story, just another population trying to survive. What made our species different wasn't strength. Neanderthals were more powerful, with denser bones and greater muscle mass, built for cold climates and close-range hunting. It wasn't brain size either. Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. What set Homo sapiens apart was something harder to see in the fossil record, a talent for connection. We formed larger social networks, we exchanged ideas, tools, and mates across greater distances. We told stories, and somewhere along the way we developed an almost compulsive drive to explore, to walk over the next hill just to see what was there. That drive is what set the stage for the encounters we're about to explore. Around 100,000 years ago, give or take tens of thousands of years since the evidence is scattered and imperfect, groups of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa in earnest. They weren't the first hominins to make this journey. Homo erectus had done it nearly 2 million years earlier, but this wave was different. These were people who looked, thought, and communicated in ways we would recognize as fundamentally human. They crossed into the Levant, the region we now call the Middle East. They followed coastlines into South Asia. Eventually, they pushed into Europe, into the vast steppes of Central Asia, and across land bridges into what is now Southeast Asia and beyond. These lands were not empty. Neanderthals had already been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew the terrain. They knew which plants were edible, which caves offered shelter from the brutal Ice Age winters, how to track migrating reindeer and mammoth across frozen tundra. Further east, in Siberia and parts of Asia, the Denisovans held their own territory, a population so mysterious that scientists only confirmed their existence in 2010 from a single finger bone and a couple of teeth found in a cave. So when small bands of Homo sapiens pushed out of Africa, they were not walking into an empty world. They were walking into someone else's home. We will never know exactly what those first meetings looked like. There are no written accounts, no oral histories that survived 100 millennia intact. What we have instead are fragments, bones, tools, genes, and educated reconstruction. But we can imagine the moment with some confidence because it must have repeated itself hundreds of times in hundreds of places over tens of thousands of years. A group of Homo sapiens, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, moving through unfamiliar territory. They round a bend in a river valley and see smoke from a cooking fire. They see figures, clearly human in shape, clearly using fire and tools, clearly organised into some kind of social group, but subtly wrong. Heavier brows, barrel chests, a different cadence to their movements, perhaps even a different way of communicating altogether. What would you feel in that moment? Curiosity, fear, both at once. Anthropologists and geneticists who study these encounters believe the reactions varied enormously, from violent conflict to cautious trade to something far more intimate. We know this because of a discovery that shocked the scientific world less than 2 decades ago. In 2010, a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo, who would later win the Nobel Prize for this work, announced something extraordinary. They had sequenced the Neanderthal genome, extracted from ancient bone fragments and compared it to the DNA of living humans. The result overturned decades of assumption. Most people whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. Not as a metaphor, not as a rough evolutionary kinship. Actual, physical strands of Neanderthal genetic code sitting inside the cells of billions of living people today, including quite possibly you. This meant something the scientific community had largely dismissed for decades. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals didn't just meet, they had children together. Not once, not in one isolated incident. The genetic evidence suggests interbreeding happened repeatedly across thousands of years in multiple locations as the two populations overlapped in the Middle East, in Europe, and possibly elsewhere. And Neanderthals weren't the only ones. That same year, the mysterious Denisovans entered the story. Genetic analysis of that single finger bone from Siberia revealed a population distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. A kind of genetic cousin more closely related to Neanderthals than to us, but still its own branch of the family tree. And once again, the evidence showed interbreeding. Modern populations in Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, the highest concentration of archaic ancestry found anywhere in living humans. Even more remarkably, in 2018, scientists analysing a bone fragment from Denisova Cave discovered the remains of a teenage girl who was neither fully Neanderthal nor fully Denisovan. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father was Denisovan. She was, quite literally, a first-generation hybrid, proof that these different human species weren't just crossing paths. They were forming families. Here's what makes this story more than ancient trivia. Those genetic gifts from our archaic relatives weren't random. Many of them helped us survive. Consider Tibet. Populations living at extreme high altitude on the Tibetan plateau carry a gene variant called EPAS1, which helps their bodies process oxygen efficiently in thin mountain air. Researchers traced this gene back to the Denisovans. Homo sapiens moving into high-altitude Asia inherited a survival tool from a species that had already spent tens of thousands of years adapting to those exact conditions. Or consider immune systems. Several genes involved in modern human immune response, genes that help us recognize and fight off pathogens, trace back to Neanderthal ancestry. When Homo sapiens left Africa and encountered new environments, new climates, and new diseases, interbreeding with populations that had already adapted to those regions may have offered a genetic shortcut, a kind of borrowed resilience. Even traits like skin pigmentation, hair texture, and fat metabolism in some populations show Neanderthal genetic fingerprints, likely reflecting adaptations to colder, lower sunlight environments that Neanderthals had already spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving for. But it wasn't all beneficial. Some inherited genes are linked in modern studies to increased risk for conditions like depression, blood clotting disorders, and certain skin conditions. Evolution isn't a story of pure triumph. It's a messy, mixed inheritance, costs and benefits tangled together, passed down across 1,000 centuries. In a very real sense, then, those first encounters between strangers weren't just a historical curiosity. They rewrote the biological toolkit of our species in ways that still shape human bodies today. It would be a mistake to romanticize these encounters as universally peaceful. The archaeological record hints at a more complicated picture. One that likely included violence, competition, and displacement alongside cooperation and kinship. Some researchers point to skeletal evidence suggesting interpersonal conflict between archaic and modern humans, though direct proof of large-scale violence between species remains limited and debated. What's clearer is competition for resources. Both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens hunted many of the same animals, used similar territories for shelter, and needed the same seasonal resources to survive brutal Ice Age winters. When two populations compete for the same limited resources, conflict becomes more likely, whether through direct violence or through the slower squeeze of one group outcompeting another for food, shelter, and territory. There's also the possibility of an even quieter kind of displacement. Homo sapiens may have simply out-organized their Neanderthal neighbors. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens lived in larger social groups, maintained wider trade and communication networks across greater distances, and may have specialized labor and resources more effectively. Some archaeologists argue this gave sapiens communities more resilience during the extreme climate swings of the last Ice Age, allowing them to recover from bad years that might have permanently crippled a smaller, more isolated Neanderthal group. So, the truth of these ancient meetings is not a single story, but many. In one valley, perhaps a violent confrontation over hunting grounds. In another, generations of cautious neighbourly coexistence. And in another still, a young man and woman from different human species falling into a relationship whose descendants would eventually spread across the globe. By roughly 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. Not overnight, the disappearance stretched across thousands of years, and it likely happened at different rates in different regions. But eventually, the distinct Neanderthal populations across Europe and Western Asia ceased to exist as a separate group. The Denisovans followed a similarly quiet exit, vanishing from the direct fossil and genetic records sometime after 40,000 years ago, though traces of their DNA persisted much longer in the populations they had interbred with. Why did this happen? Scientists still debate the exact combination of causes. Climate change was almost certainly a factor. The later stages of the Ice Age brought extreme rapid fluctuations in temperature that would have devastated small, specialized populations. Competition with the growing and expanding populations of Homo sapiens likely played a role too, whether through direct resource competition or simply being demographically overwhelmed by a species that reproduced and expanded more successfully. And then there's interbreeding itself. Some researchers have proposed that as Neanderthal and Denisovan populations dwindled in size and as intermixing with the much larger and faster-growing Homo sapiens population continued, the distinct genetic identity of these smaller groups was gradually absorbed rather than eliminated. In other words, they may not have simply died out. In part, they may have dissolved into us. It's a strange, almost poetic possibility that the disappearance of the Neanderthals and Denisovans wasn't purely an extinction, but partly an absorption, not erased from the world, but blended into the ongoing story of a single, increasingly interconnected human species. Every population alive today carries some trace of these ancient meetings, whether from Neanderthals, Denisovans, or, as some emerging research suggests, other archaic populations we haven't fully identified yet, sometimes referred to as ghost populations, detectable only through subtle genetic echoes in living people, particularly in parts of Africa where fossil evidence remains sparse. This challenges a deep, often unconscious assumption many of us carry, that human history is a story of separate peoples who occasionally, exceptionally, came into contact. The genetic evidence suggests something closer to the opposite. Mixing between different human populations, even different human species, wasn't the exception. It was a recurring, almost routine feature of our deep history. Every time Homo sapiens expanded into new territory, they encountered people who were already there. Sometimes those people looked remarkably similar to them. Sometimes, as with the Neanderthals and Denisovans, they represented an entirely different branch of the human family tree, separated by hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. And in an enormous number of these encounters, whether through cautious alliance, mutual curiosity, or simple human attraction across difference, strangers became family. It's worth sitting with what this actually means. For most of human history, we've told ourselves stories about purity, about bloodlines, about us versus them, about the dangerous stranger on the other side of the river. But the deepest layer of our biology tells a different story. It tells us that the encounter with the stranger, the outsider, the different-looking other, is not a threat to human identity. It is human identity. It's written into our immune systems, our ability to survive at high altitude, quite possibly into aspects of our cognition and behaviour that scientists are still working to understand. The Homo sapiens, who walked out of Africa 70,000 or 100,000 years ago, did not survive and spread across the planet by staying isolated and unchanging. They survived in part because they were willing, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes violently, but often enough successfully, to engage with difference, to learn from populations who already knew how to live in a new land, to form bonds, even families, across a gap of hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. We are, quite literally, made from those meetings. So what really happened when ancient humans met strangers? The honest answer is many things all at once across tens of thousands of years and thousands of separate encounters. Fear and curiosity, conflict and cooperation, displacement and absorption, endings and quiet continuations. But underneath all of that complexity is a simple, almost startling truth. Those strangers didn't just influence our history, they became part of our biology. Every time you look in the mirror, you're looking at the living result of thousands of ancient meetings between different kinds of humans. Meetings none of us remember, but all of us carry. The next time you meet someone who looks, thinks, or lives differently than you do, it might be worth remembering your ancestors have been here before, and more often than history usually admits, they found a way to become something new together.